All right, welcome to lecture number 3 of the Progressive Era. Today we're going to start talking about who the progressives were as far as the presidents go. So today we're going to focus mainly or exclusively on Teddy Roosevelt and what he accomplished as president as far as the progressive movement goes. Okay, so we're going to start off with Teddy Roosevelt. You look at this picture, you can see a lot of different images of Teddy Roosevelt, and the fact that some of the biggest things you see are antlers and deer. Kind of part of his personality and showing his strength, that he was an avid hunter. So we're going to go into kind of who Teddy Roosevelt is right here. So he is the son of a wealthy New York family. He grew up sickly, so he was little, he was weak, he was sick all the time, and it's kind of like fueled his intensity to become a strong person. So he didn't like being a weakling. So he took up sports like hunting, boxing, wrestling. He was a swimmer. He swam in the Potomac River. Things that normal people don't do, he felt that he needed to do to prove his strength and his might. His personality made him a ferocious reformer, so when he does become president, he's going to want to take on the big guys. He's not okay with letting the little guys suffer. So as a governor of New York, he becomes someone that tries to take on the political machines. We talked about Tammany Hall. He wants to break these things down so they're not as strong as they were, and he wants to look out for the little guy here as well. His ability to take on the power system made enemies, even within his own party. People were afraid of him. They didn't want him to tear down big business. He didn't want them to reform the way that society was. So even the Republican Party was against him. So he's more of a liberal Republican. If you put him on the scale of the political spectrum of today, he'd be like almost a crazy liberal because of the actions that he took. It's a lot more progressive back then than it is today. So he was seen as a threat, as I said, to the Republican Party, so they tried to hide him. When William McKinley, who you've heard of before, was running for president again in 1900, and the people of his party, the Republican Party, wanted to kind of hide him, but give him like the idea that they thought that he had power, so they put him in the vice presidency. They made him William McKinley's vice president, and as McKinley won election again, he became vice president along with under McKinley. And the ironic thing that happens is that William McKinley is assassinated in his first term, and Teddy Roosevelt, who was supposed to be hid as vice president, actually becomes president. They felt that the vice president didn't really have much power, so he would be taken out of the limelight as governor of New York and kind of put away, and he'd kind of be stored there until the next election, and he wouldn't really have any power, and someone else would win an election, so he would never ever really gain the power that he wanted. But this doesn't happen. So he's known as the accidental president because he's accidentally put into power and by the Republicans, and they didn't really want that. So it's kind of ironic. Some presidential firsts. He's the first to ride an airplane first and an automobile. He invites an African American who's Booker T. Washington to the White House. We'll talk about later. He's the first to dive in a submarine, to have a telephone in the house, and to travel outside the United States. So again, his progressivism isn't just his policies, but also his actions. Here's a picture of William McKinley. This is McKinley right here, and he's being assassinated. This guy has a gun under the handkerchief, and that's what leads to Teddy Roosevelt becoming president. All right, so Teddy Roosevelt, first thing is he uses something called the bully pulpit in order to kind of pass his progressive agenda. So obviously as president, you have this huge forum to speak to. I mean, you're the most important person in the free world, and he uses that forum, that pulpit, in order to pass his progressive agenda. So he's determined to take power from the rich businessmen and redistribute it to the common American. And this sounds more like what the Democrat Party would be talking about, but back then, as I said, both sides were a little bit more on the liberal side. And his plan to do this was called the Square Deal. Here we're going to talk about the Square Deal here. So the first part of the Square Deal, the square because it has 4 sides, so there's 4 parts of the Square Deal that we're going to talk about. So the first part is trust busting. Teddy Roosevelt believed that powerful government was essential to a key democracy. So you have to have a strong government in order to regulate other aspects of government. A small government would not be able to tackle these big businesses. So the only way to tackle big business is to grow the government. So he felt that big business was also essential, but it was corrupt and evil. And these trusts hurt people. And the government's job was to protect the general welfare of the people. So he needed to break down these trusts to protect the people's welfare. So he used the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we talked about, to sue 44 trusts. Not all of his suits went through, and not all of them were successful, but some of them were. As I talked about in the past, there's another act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, that will come and be more powerful, and it does a better job of breaking down the trust. But because of this, because of him breaking down 44 trusts, he's known as a trust buster. Okay, that's kind of one of his nicknames. The second side, or the second corner of the square deal, is labor and regulation. All right, so this really comes to a front in 1902. He's been president for a year, and there's a strike at a coal mine in Pennsylvania. And with winter approaching, coal supplies are running low. Teddy Roosevelt felt that he needed to step in because if people didn't have coal, they would freeze to death during the winter. There's a huge stockpile of coal, so the strike could go on for a while. The problem with that is, though, as the stockpile lowers and lowers, that raises the price. And so the coal companies actually are okay with the strike in a limited amount because they are actually making more money for the coal that they already had on hand, and they weren't paying workers either. So it was kind of good on both sides, or for both sides. But Teddy Roosevelt steps in, and he puts down the strike. He actually negotiates 9-hour workdays, and does actually help the businesses by raising the price of coal. But he sets a precedent to future presidents that if labor strikes are happening, then the government can come in and step in and help the citizens when these citizens are directly affected. So when their welfare is affected, it's okay for a president to step in. So he's expanding his power as president and in the power of the executive. All right, the next corner is guarding consumer health. So Teddy Roosevelt read The Jungle. He was disgusted, just like you and me, and he felt that he needed to fix it. So in 1906, he signs the Meat Inspection Act, which mandates strict cleanliness in the meat plants, and he sets up an inspection system. He also passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which requires labeling, or truth in the labeling, and it bans the sale of contaminated food. Okay, and so these are basic things that make sense. Both of these acts are still in place today, so Teddy Roosevelt's policies are still working 100 years later. The final corner of the square deal is conservation. Teddy Roosevelt is known as the first green president. He really appreciated nature. He was an outdoorsman, a hunter. He wanted to make sure that he had save the natural beauty of our country. That's one of the most important things about our country, is all the forests and nature and natural resources, all these things that we have that other countries don't have, are reasons why we became so successful. So he saw conservation as a primary concern. There's a picture here of him and John Muir. They're at Yosemite National Park. Many of you have probably been there. There's a famous waterfall in the background. He created this as a national park so that we are able to go there today. If he didn't do this, who knows if it would have been logged and if it would have been destroyed. So really cool things that he did. He created wildlife preserves and national parks. He set up a U.S. Geological Survey to explore for resources so that we're not like just blanketly, cutting down and tearing down natural resources, searching for resources like gold and silver. We're doing it in a planned, thought-out manner. All right, so conservation was key to Teddy Roosevelt. One of the problems that Teddy Roosevelt didn't really fix or aim to fix too much was the idea of civil rights, especially of African Americans. So civil rights was a touchy subject because there's still the Jim Crow laws of the South, and if you're trying to win elections, you still need to get votes from the South, so you don't want to anger the South too much. So instead of promoting African Americans as a whole, as like trying to lift up the whole race, he would promote individuals. So he'd appoint African Americans to positions in the South, like into federal positions in Southern South, so that they would have say in politics. He invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House, and that was a huge issue because he was the first African American to come to the White House, and Teddy Roosevelt got a lot of accolades for this, and people really appreciated it, especially blacks. But a lot of white Southerners hated this, and he got a lot of criticism for it as well. So he didn't really think it was such a big deal, but afterwards he kind of was like, oh, that was kind of a big deal. But he didn't see an issue with it. So the lack of full support led to black self-representation. So they had to represent themselves and try to push for things themselves because they knew they weren't going to get it through the government. So they formed the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. Still around today, still prominent today, still in action today. And their main goal is to promote the equality of the races. So they were going to kind of step up where the government couldn't really do anything. And just to kind of finish it off on the importance of the square deal, it changed American society by setting a precedent that powerful government should regulate business on behalf of citizens, expanding the power and the role of the president forever in the lives of the public, ending abusive and negligent corporate practices, and officially ending the Gilded Age. It just kind of shows that the government needs to be there in order to help people. In a 100% free market, businesses can take advantage of people and really bring them down. And to have a flourishing economy and a flourishing society, you have to have a strong middle class. And this is the idea of trying to create a middle class and allowing people to rise up through hard work and be successful. All right, that's Teddy Roosevelt, and thanks.